So last week I was at this small dinner party, and the conversation, it turned to a mutual friend who's recently had a lot of success.
Okay.
And one guy there, let's just call him Mark, he suddenly gets incredibly focused. His whole tone just sharpens.
Oh, I think I know where this is going.
He starts just tearing this friend apart. He's calling him shameless and desperate for validation. He kept saying he's just doing all this because he's terrified of being seen as a failure.
Wow.
Yeah. And he's leaning in. His eyes are wide, like he's uncovered some, dark conspiracy about this friend's soul. But then the topic shifts to Mark's own job. Immediately, the anger turns into this different kind of intensity. He starts complaining about how his coworkers don't respect his authority, how he feels invisible, even though he's the most talented person in the room. He spent the next 20 minutes just obsessing over his own image and how much he feared being overlooked. The transition was almost seamless, but it was so contradictory. The very desperation and fear of failure he'd just used as insults. Well, it turns out those were the exact things keeping him up at night. He wasn't describing his friend at all. He was giving me a guided tour of his own deepest insecurities.
That's incredible.
It just left me wondering how many of the truths we state about other people are actually just mirrors of the things we can't stand about ourselves.
It's an incredibly powerful and common scenario, because what you witnessed was the psychological process of projection. And it's driven by an even more fundamental engine, self-deception.
Self-deception.
Yeah, we all kind of operate under this assumption that the human mind is a truth seeker, right? That it's constantly striving for objective accuracy. But when you look at it from an evolutionary psychology perspective, you realize the mind's ultimate goal isn't necessarily truth.
It's fitness.
It's survival status and reproductive success.
So truth is really just secondary to survival.
Absolutely. I mean, our psychology evolved over millions of years to navigate these really complex, ancient social hierarchies. We were in small groups, cooperative relationships where, resources were scarce and your reputation was everything.
Okay.
And sometimes the most effective strategy for gaining status or, say, avoiding punishment is to successfully deceive other people. And to do that reliably, well, you first have to lie to yourself.
So it's a system built for social leverage, not objective reality.
That's it, exactly.
I've always thought of self-deception as a sort of cozy defense mechanism, something we do to feel better about ourselves, a purely internal thing. But you're positioning it as something more dynamic, an offensive strategy almost, an interpersonal weapon designed to maximize success in a competitive social world.
That is precisely what we're going to unpack in this deep dive. Our mission here is to analyze the counterintuitive, really surprising function of self-deception. Its calculated role in social competition, in status, how it influences our mating strategies, and maybe most critically, how these ancient strategies are now collapsing when they collide head-on with the completely novel environment of the digital age.
Okay, let's jump right in then. Section 1, self-deception as an interpersonal weapon. If the theory is that we deceive ourselves mainly to help us deceive others, let's explore the mechanics of that. Why is lying to yourself a prerequisite for being a good liar?
It all comes down to cognitive load.
Yeah.
The problem with conscious lying is that it's hard work for the brain.
Cognitive load.
Yeah. If you're knowingly suppressing the truth, you're saying, I finished the project when you know you haven't.
Yeah.
Your conscious mind is actively juggling two conflicting pieces of information.
Right, the truth and the lie.
You have to monitor your speech. You have to maintain the lie's narrative so it's consistent.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you have to actively push down the true memory. That suppression is mentally taxing. And that stress, that cognitive burden, it leaks out.
And that leakage, that's what people or polygraphs pick up on, the physiological tells.
Exactly. When you're consciously lying, you emit all these subtle, unconscious cues. Microexpressions, slight increases in heart rate, changes in your vocal pitch, or fluctuations in skin conductance. These are all unconscious signals. It's your brain struggling to manage that internal conflict.
But if you can trick yourself.
But if you can truly, genuinely convince yourself that the lie, or maybe a highly exaggerated version of reality, is the truth, then you eliminate those conscious markers of deceit.
Because there's no conflict anymore.
There's no conflict. You are no longer suppressing the truth. You are genuinely reporting what you believe to be true. You become a far more effective and physiologically calm liar because you actually believe your own story.
So the brain is basically trading objective accuracy for improved social efficacy. It's optimizing for believability over truth.
Yes.
But how does the mind even do that? It's not just forgetting, right? How can I know the genuine facts but sincerely believe the falsehood at the same time?
Well, that gets us into the dual retrieval hypothesis, which is a way of describing the mechanics of this internal split.
Dual retrieval.
Yeah, the mind seems to be capable of segmenting information access, splitting it. The truthful information often gets sequestered. It gets pushed away to parts of the memory system that are outside of immediate high-level conscious access. It might be living more in the unconscious or implicit memory.
So it's like a file that's buried deep in a secure folder on a computer.
Precisely.
Yeah.
That's a great analogy. And the conscious reporting part of your mind, it accepts and operates based on the motivated misrepresentation, the lie.
That separation seems critical.
It is. By keeping the truthful data out of your conscious awareness, the conscious self can't detect its own deceptive intent. And since you're not aware you're lying, you don't generate those telltale physiological cues. It prevents others from detecting the deception. It's an elegant, if maybe morally ambiguous, internal firewall.
And that firewall, that structural separation, sounds hugely advantageous, especially in a high-stakes social environment. And I imagine that protection goes beyond just the moment of the lie itself. What if you get caught later?
And that is the critical secondary advantage, avoiding retribution. In our ancestral social groups, retribution for intentional deceit was, well, it was swift and severe. Ostracization, violence, maybe even expulsion from the group.
A death sentence, basically.
It could be. And when judging a transgression, the social group places immense importance on the attribution of intent. If a rival figures out you knowingly, maliciously harmed them for your own personal gain, the cost is maximal.
But if you can argue that it was unintentional.
Exactly. If you are sufficiently self-deceived, you can sincerely plead ignorance. You can claim you were inept, rather than that you were malicious. You argue that the act was a mistake, an accidental error based on what you genuinely thought was true, not a calculated harm.
You turn a capital offense into a misdemeanor.
You do. By successfully persuading the social jury that it was unintentional, the self-deceiver is in a much, much better position to avoid those severe costs. It enhances long-term fitness.
This mechanism applies perfectly to that story about Mark. He wasn't just lying to us when he called his successful friend desperate. He had genuinely convinced himself that the friend's success was rooted in insecurity.
Yeah.
Which allowed him to sincerely believe his own negative evaluation. And that protected him from having to confront his own feelings of failure.
Exactly. And Mark's behavior is a perfect illustration of how self-deception often takes the form of self-enhancement. We convince ourselves we are better, or stronger, or more moral than we really are. It allows us to display greater confidence and competence, which is just inherently appealing to others. In social settings, confidence is a huge influencer when people are selecting leaders or allies or mates. So that overconfidence bias actually serves a function. It makes us more attractive social partners.
So a little dose of self-delusion is basically a performance enhancer in the social arena.
It is. And now think about the flip side, which Mark also demonstrated, the derogation of others.
Tearing other people down.
Right. When people experience a threat to their self-image like failing a test or being overshadowed by a successful peer, they often try to restore their ego by actively derogating or negatively rating other people. This is an offensive tool used explicitly for social advancement and ego protection.
So when Mark felt invisible at his job, he needed to make his friend's success invisible too by reframing it as a flaw.
Precisely. Studies show this. When participants fail some measure of intellectual ability, they get an immediate drop in self-esteem. To rebound, what do? They negatively rate unrelated third parties, sometimes people from disliked groups.
And they really believe it.
Crucially, yes. They don't just pretend the other person is worse. The psychological data suggests they truly incorporate that negative evaluation. The process works because they self-deceptively make that external target the source of their threat, and that makes them feel better. The belief in the external flaw is manufactured internally to protect the ego.
That explains why the accusation was so intense. Mark had to believe it himself for it to work as an emotional counterweight. It's a beautifully cynical piece of cognitive engineering.
It is. And this belief in self-enhancement is so powerful. It operates even at the most implicit, unconscious levels. We see this really clearly in studies of self-image. Researchers looked into what is sometimes called the believable lie in self-perception, and they used digitally morphed images.
Okay, tell me about the methodology here.
So they created a spectrum of images of a participant's face. It ranged from slightly less attractive than their actual photo to slightly more attractive.
Right.
Participants were then briefly shown these photos and asked to quickly select the image that matched their current appearance. And the finding was incredibly consistent.
What was it?
Individuals were significantly faster and more accurate at locating images of themselves when those images had been digitally altered to be more attractive than their objective actual photograph.
Wow. So the unconscious mind is literally editing reality, giving us this positive bias.
It suggests that your internal template of your self-image, the visual picture you hold in your mind's eye, is already enhanced. The actual objective image of yourself takes longer to process because it doesn't quite match the self-deceptively enhanced template that's already there, ready to go.
So you believe the lie deep down.
The inaccuracy is truly believed at an implicit level, and the size of this self-enhancement effect was found to correlate with participants' implicit self-esteem. The function of this bias is pretty clear. It enables people to display unwarranted but genuine confidence in their social interactions.
So the utility and activation of self-deception aren't constant. They're governed by the immediate social stakes.
That's a great way to put it, which naturally leads us into section 2, status hierarchies and adaptive deception. This is where we see how competition really dictates the necessity of self-deceiving.
We've established this co-evolutionary struggle between deceivers and detectors, but when you bring hierarchy into it, the stakes change completely. How does status regulate this arms race?
Status regulates the perceived probability of detection, and just as important, the severity of the punishment. In competitive social environments, the arms race is most intense between low-status deceivers and high-status detectors.
Why that dynamic specifically?
Well, high-status individuals have more resources, social capital, power, alliances that they can use for effective detection and swift punishment. They just have the time and the influence to verify claims and enforce retribution.
And if you're low status, you have less to lose in absolute terms, maybe, but everything to gain from a successful deception.
Yes, exactly. Low-status individuals are under constant pressure to improve their deceptive ploys. They're often trying to access resources controlled by superiors or just escape punishment. If you're trying to hide a mistake from your boss, the consequence of failure is far greater than if you're trying to hide it from a coworker.
So the need to actually believe the lie, the self-deception part, becomes strategically vital only when the target is high status.
That's the key.
Does this high-stakes hierarchical deception hold true across other species?
Oh, it's highly consistent. We see clear cross-species evidence of these status-based tactics. For instance, in chimpanzee groups, subordinate males will only attempt to retrieve, say, a highly desired piece of hidden food when they are certain they are unseen by a high-status competitor.
They have to be covert.
They're forced to be because the cost of detection is immediate and often violent aggression.
Yeah.
They know they can't successfully bluff the alpha.
Yep.
And you see even more elaborate cognitive tricks in other animals. Radins and pigs, which are known for their social intelligence, will take these complex, unnecessary detours specifically to mislead high-status members of their group away from a food stash they've found.
So the subordinate animals are constantly using cognitive tactics to deceive up the hierarchy to avoid conflict or theft.
At any time.
And in the human workplace, the modern analog to these hierarchical struggles.
The supervisor-subordinate relationship mirrors this evolutionary dynamic perfectly. Staff will routinely hide errors or bad news or customer complaints from their managers. A sales associate might, misrepresent their success rate to a regional supervisor.
And the superior is on the lookout for it.
The superior, on the other hand, remains hyper-vigilant for subordinate deceit because their own status depends on the honest performance of their team.
So organizational distrust is in some ways just an inherent feature of hierarchy, driven by this ancient status-regulated arms race.
It is. And it explains why certain modern management techniques, like moving towards self-managed work groups or increasing transparency, are basically attempts to dismantle this status-regulated mindset.
By flattening the hierarchy, they're trying to reduce the need for self-deception and covert behavior.
Exactly. And thereby improve productivity and trust. It reframes organizational design not just as an efficiency problem, but as a mechanism for mitigating evolved psychological conflict.
Let's look at the most direct empirical evidence for this deceiving up idea. Did researchers actually test whether the target status literally changes the deceiver's internal memory state?
Yes, they did, in a really landmark experiment designed to isolate this specific effect. They brought participants into a lab and gave them material to learn. Then they were incentivized, motivated, to lie about what they had learned to another person.
And the key manipulation was the status of the target.
That was the critical manipulation. One group lied to a high-status individual framed as a teacher or an evaluator, and the other group lied to an equal-status individual who was framed as a fellow student.
And what did they measure?
They measured the participants' memory for the true material after they had delivered the lie. The hypothesis was that if self-deception is strategically activated to make the lie easier, then the high-status threat should cause a suppression of the truth.
And that's what happened.
And that's exactly what they found. When participants were forced to lie, they experienced significantly worse memory for the truthful material. They had effectively suppressed it from conscious recall. But, and this is the key, only when the target of the deception was the high-status teacher.
Wow.
When they lied to the equal-status student, their memory for the true material was significantly better. It was much closer to their baseline performance when they were telling the truth.
So the brain literally chose to obscure the truth from itself. It actively engaged self-deception, but only when the perceived cost of getting caught was highest, when the teacher, the superior authority, was listening. That is powerful evidence.
It is. It implies self-deception isn't some pervasive tendency. It's strategically modulated. It's a tool that gets activated when the social leverage it provides, the ability to pass off an intentional deception as an unintentional error, is at its peak.
The low-status deceiver needs it to survive.
They do.
So what about the high-status deceiver? If the threat of detection is lower for them, do they still need to employ self-deception?
Not in the same defensive way. High-status individuals are often characterized as becoming, well, unscrupulous and bold in their deception. They've already earned the social capital, so they're just less likely to be challenged when they exaggerate their efforts or brag about their abilities.
Their status is like a social shield.
It is. It makes their lies inherently more plausible to the group. And this is supported physiologically. When high-status humans are engaged in deceiving others, they show significantly less physiological stress, fewer changes in heart rate, lower skin conductance, compared to their low-status counterparts.
They're just calmer liars.
Much calmer. Because they operate with a confidence that stems not from deep self-deception, but from the social reality that their position protects them from immediate challenge and punishment. They can be more consciously manipulative without paying that same internal price.
That transition from status competition in the workplace to reproductive competition seems very logical. Both are high-stakes, zero-sum games in terms of fitness.
They are.
So let's move into Section 3, self-deception and mating strategies. How does this adaptive deception play out in committed relationships?
So it's pervasive. It often manifests in the behaviors we call mate guarding.
Mate guarding.
It refers to any set of behaviors, conscious or unconscious, that males and females use to maintain exclusive sexual access, discourage their current mate from leaving, and of course, ward off potential rivals. The intense, often irrational psychological state of sexual jealousy is the prime example of this mechanism at work.
And I'm guessing, as with most evolutionary problems, the strategies differ because the adaptive problems faced by each sex were historically distinct.
Very distinct.
Let's start with the key sex differences in these mate-guarding behaviors.
Male tactics, historically, were acutely focused on preventing sexual infidelity. This is because men face the risk of cuckoldry investing resources in genetically unrelated offspring.
The ultimate fitness cost.
The ultimate cost. So their strategies often involve direct control and display. They might physically hide their partner from rivals by limiting her social exposure or request she wear overt symbols of possession like an engagement ring or even their own clothing like a jacket.
And resource display.
And conspicuous signaling of resources, yes. Buying elaborate gifts to demonstrate their value as a provider, making the mate less likely to stray.
And what about more aggressive tactics?
Men are statistically more likely to employ threatening or even outright violent behavior toward what we call intrasexual rivals, other men perceived as poachers, than women are toward female rivals.
So if male strategies are about resource display and threat management, what are the characteristic female tactics?
Female strategies tend to focus on neutralizing the threat of attractive, fertile women. The potential poachers who might draw their partner away for long-term investment, they're generally less likely to engage in direct poaching themselves, but they are hyper-vigilant about the social environment.
So they're policing their social circle to manage rival risk.
Exactly. Female mate guarding often concentrates on creating larger social distance between themselves and attractive ovulating females.
And it's that specific.
It is. Studies show that a woman will intentionally create greater social distance between herself and a competing female only if that rival is perceived as ovulating and attractive, and crucially, only if the woman is partnered with a mate considered highly desirable because of his paternal value, his resources, his reliability, his willingness to invest.
It's all about avoiding a threat to resource stability and paternal investment.
And these cues are often subtle, picked up unconsciously, but they effectively drive that protective behavior.
This sounds like a set of pretty conscious, deliberate strategies. Buying gifts, wearing a ring, managing your friends. But you mentioned earlier that the most potent defenses against infidelity are the automatic self-deceptive biases.
Yes.
How does our psychology automatically maintain commitment without us even really trying?
This is where the fidelity studies reveal the profound power of non-conscious control. We rely on these internal self-regulating biases to maintain monogamy, often way more effectively than any conscious vow. Researchers have identified two primary automatic biases.
Okay, let's look at the first one, the attentional bias.
The attentional bias governs where we focus our mental energy. Longitudinal studies of newlywed couples tracked their commitment over time, and they found that individuals who were highly committed would automatically and very quickly disengage their attention from photos of attractive opposite-sex relationship alternatives.
They just look away faster.
Much faster. They don't linger. And the measurement was astonishingly precise. Being just 100 milliseconds faster, that's 1/10 of a second, to shift attention away from an attractive alternative was associated with an approximately 50% decrease in the odds of that person committing infidelity over the next 3 years.
That is genuinely wild. A microsecond of non-conscious processing can have your risk of cheating. This suggests fidelity isn't a continuous battle of willpower, but a deep, automatic neurological reflex.
It really demonstrates the speed and efficiency of these non-conscious controls. The mind is actively, automatically preventing the necessary cognitive steps, like dwelling on the alternative that would come before conscious temptation.
So what's the second mechanism?
The second powerful mechanism is the evaluative devaluation bias.
The mind actively convinces itself the competition isn't worth the trouble.
Precisely. Individuals in committed, satisfying relationships automatically rate attractive alternatives as significantly less physically appealing compared to single people making the exact same ratings.
So single people don't have this internal protective bias.
They don't. The data show that rating alternatives 2 scale points lower in attractiveness was also associated with about a 50% decrease in the odds of infidelity over that same time frame.
So in essence, the mind systematically biases attention away from alternatives and actively devalues them. It's a self-deceptive maintenance strategy that keeps the relationship stable by altering your perceived reality of the outside world.
Yes, you genuinely believe the alternative isn't that appealing, and that belief reinforces your commitment. It's the ultimate evolutionary mechanism for protecting a massive investment. Your mind tricks itself into thinking it's not missing out.
And unfaithful people in these studies.
They took significantly longer to disengage attention, and they didn't display this devaluation bias. They rated alternatives just as highly as single people did.
But of course, no relationship is perfectly stable, and we know that resistance to mate guarding exists. It often leads to deception within the relationship. When does this self-deceptive control system start to fail or get actively resisted?
Resistance often emerges when the mate guarding itself becomes overly possessive or demanding, or when the male partner is perceived as having low genetic quality, so low sexual attractiveness relative to his resources.
The provider versus stud trade-off.
Right. If the male's a good provider, but maybe a poor genetic prospect, the female faces a fitness trade-off. So women with partners who are overly jealous or controlling or low in sexual attractiveness compared to alternatives are far more likely to resist these mate guarding efforts.
And how does deception play into that resistance?
They often employ covert tactics to resist the partner's control. And this behavior is strongly connected to certain personality traits. For example, women who score high in Machiavellianism,
manipulativeness, cynicism.
Exactly. Strategic self-interest. They're far more likely to resist mate-guarding attempts and rely on covert, deceptive tactics like secret social media use or meeting rivals in hidden locations. They are, in essence, using their own psychological prowess and deception skills to control the relationship dynamic, subverting the mate-guarding while maintaining the facade of commitment.
A calculated effort to maximize fitness, requiring a high degree of deception.
We have established that the evolved mind is this expert system for maximizing social leverage through motivated information control and self-deception.
Right.
Now, we have to ask the big question. What happens when that system, which was optimized for small group dynamics, is ported into an environment it was never, ever designed for? This brings us to Section 4, evolutionary mismatch in the digital age.
This is the core concept of evolutionary mismatch, that our psychological mechanisms, which were optimized for the ancestral environment, the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, or EEA, they generate misaligned or even actively maladaptive outputs when they're confronted with evolutionarily novel modern environments.
That's the framework exactly. In ancestral times, social information was low quantity but high quality. You knew everything about your core group of maybe 150 people, and that information was crucial for survival.
And
Today, social media floods us with an exponentially large, low-quality volume of social information. It's an endless feed of comparison and status signals. This massive, novel input excessively triggers our evolved mechanisms that are sensitive to our inclusionary status.
So it's not just the high volume of information, it's that the sheer volume overloads a system designed to assess status threats and opportunities within a tiny tribe. It's like turning a threat detection dial for a small room and just cranking it to the max setting for an entire city.
That's a perfect analogy. And it leads to these maladaptive outputs like chronic fear of missing out or excessive use of social media just for status monitoring, which takes resources away from more fitness-enhancing activities. But now let's look at a new pressure. How artificial intelligence and automation interact with our most fundamental motive, which is status seeking.
We don't compete with AI for food, but it definitely triggers anxiety. How does that happen?
The anxiety is caused by what we can call skill creep. Automation, advanced analytics, sophisticated cyber-physical systems. They are causing once competitive, high-value human skills to become obsolete at a dizzying pace.
So it's not just about losing jobs.
It's not. It creates an inherent competitive instability. It necessitates constantly learning new skills simply to stay competitive in the economic hierarchy.
That sounds like a recipe for chronic, debilitating anxiety.
It is. And this pursuit of competitive stability leads to a state of chronic anxiety that critically, actively undermines the pursuit of other fundamental long-term evolutionary goals.
How so?
If you are constantly anxious about losing your economic status because of this rapid skill creep, you are just less likely to invest time and emotional resources in maintaining social relationships or deepening family ties or even starting a family.
So the ancient motive status is being continuously triggered by a novel technological pressure, and it's creating an evolutionarily misaligned output, chronic stress and the sacrifice of reproductive investment.
It forces a psychological trade-off between economic relevance and fundamental human connection.
Okay, let's move to a phenomenon that seems completely irrational on the surface, the digital privacy paradox. People say they're worried about privacy, but then behave in a way that is utterly lax with their data.
The privacy paradox is this dramatic disconnect between people's stated rational concern for their informational privacy and their actual behavior. For example, people will consistently report that they have the highest level of concern if strangers access highly sensitive data, like their sexual orientation or political affiliation.
That makes sense.
But when you observe them, nearly half of those same concerned individuals will nonetheless self-disclose that exact information on public social platforms.
So high conscious awareness of the risk doesn't translate into protective behavior. What's the evolutionary explanation for this cognitive failure?
Our privacy concern evolved in the ancestral environment to protect three very tangible things: bodily integrity, territorial boundaries, and our reputational standing from nearby potential threats.
Nearby threats.
That's the key. This protection relied entirely on immediate, aversive emotional reactions, that visceral tightening in your gut, triggered by observable social cues. You feel threatened when someone stares over your shoulder or leans too close.
The physical sensation of intrusion.
Exactly. But in the digital world, those ancestral cues just vanish. You may rationally recognize the threat, a data breach, commercial surveillance, algorithmic manipulation, but that rational recognition fails to elicit the visceral emotional reaction you need to reliably compel protective behavior.
So our evolved privacy psychology is calibrated for physical proximity and immediate social observation, leaving it totally ill-equipped for 21st century security challenges.
Completely ill-equipped.
Let's break down the mechanics of this failure. You mentioned 3 psychological mismatches. What's the first intuition that fails us when we're dealing with data?
The first is the ownership psychology mismatch. Human intuition around ownership relies heavily on clear physical cues. Who had first possession of a resource or who invested the most labor to make it or modify it.
Right. Ownership was tied to something you could see.
Visible physical alteration or immediate guarding behavior. It helped avoid costly disputes. But digital data ownership is inherently opaque and ambiguous.
You can't smell, touch, or physically guard your data.
Exactly. Who owns your location data? Is it you, the user who generated it, the cell provider who transmitted it, the app developer who wrote the software? This ambiguity prevents the mind from recognizing digital data as a clear resource that belongs to the self. And therefore, it fails to trigger the powerful protective intuitions we have for guarding our personal property.
If we don't feel like we own it, we don't feel compelled to protect it.
That's the problem.
Okay, moving to the second failure. Personal space. The internet feels vast and anonymous, but that doesn't seem to translate into caution.
And that's the personal space mismatch. Our minds are calibrated to regulate interpersonal distance based on concrete, three-dimensional physical cues of proximity and crowding. We know from studies that when physical distance shrinks, stress hormones like cortisol increase, and that triggers an aversion response.
But online, three-dimensional social space collapses onto a two-dimensional screen.
And the mind just cannot process the difference between talking to a tribe of 150 people and posting to an audience of millions. The inability to gauge the size, the heterogeneity, the proximity of the audience means the mind fails to trigger the necessary threat signals.
So you broadcast an intimate detail to millions of strangers, but because the physical cues of crowding, that feeling of 1,000 people standing too close, are absent, the mind just allows for excessive self-disclosure.
You lose all those subtle social response cues, a change in a listener's expression, a shift in body language that you would normally use to guide and limit what you say. This is how you end up posting deeply regrettable information to an unseen mass. The threat signals are simply not being processed by the ancient part of the brain.
The absence of that visceral feeling of being exposed is the vulnerability. And finally, the third mismatch about reputation, which you said has 3 fatal flaws in the digital context.
The reputational mismatch. Our reputation management systems evolved to control socially damaging information, but that system assumed ancestral conditions. Information was localized, it was ephemeral, gossip faded quickly, and it was primarily face-to-face. The modern world introduces 3 systemic flaws that just bypass this protection.
What's the first flaw regarding data collection?
First, the invisible nature of modern data collation. In the EEA, you knew who saw what you did. Today, sophisticated algorithms gather these tiny, disparate pieces of your behavior, your search history, your purchases, your GPS pings into massive profiles. You have no awareness of who is watching or how they're consolidating that information.
So you can't manage your reputation strategically.
Ancestral projection and self-deception were designed to manage observable social flaws. They're useless against invisible algorithmic collation.
And the second flaw is the mass permanent record.
Yes, the mass permanent record of online behavior. Ancestral reputation damage was temporary and localized. You could move, or you could just wait for the scandal to die down. Digital records are forever. They're accessible everywhere, and they are searchable.
A foolish comment made once to a small group 20 years ago can be dredged up and used to destroy a career today.
The brain simply did not evolve a defense mechanism for a permanent record.
And finally, the third flaw concerning the power brokers.
The use of sophisticated surveillance by online power brokers. This data is leveraged by entities that hold immense unseen power. Governments, large corporations, sophisticated criminal networks. This collective vulnerability leaves users defenseless against coercive persecution, commercial manipulation like being targeted with ads based on deeply private psychological profiles, and criminal exploitation in ways our psychology never ever anticipated.
Our sophisticated self-deception, designed to manage our reputation among 150 peers, is utterly transparent and exploitable when it's leveraged by algorithmic logic.
To summarize this entire deep dive then, our evolved mind functions as a specialized information control system, not as a machine dedicated to objective truth. It systematically biases our perception, our memory, and our attention to maximize social leverage, status, and mating success.
And it achieves this through the powerful psychological trick of self-deception, and then the mechanism of projection onto rivals, which allows us to lie and maintain confidence without generating those telltale signs of conscious deceit.
And the profound implication here is that the very psychological architecture that helped our ancestors and helped someone like your friend Mark survive social conflict and maintain vital confidence is now battling a modern environment that has stripped away all the necessary physical cues these ancient tactics relied upon.
We're applying Stone Age psychological tools to solve problems created by microchip technology.
The ultimate revelation of this deep dive is that our primary psychological battles are not against external temptations or rivals, but against the biases embedded in our own minds. Biases that, ironically, were selected for success in a world that no longer exists, leaving our most fundamental defensive strategies vulnerable to the transparent, exploitable logic of the digital age.